Welcome to our next lecture on academic views of technology, where this time we step into the world of social construction of technology. So before this, again, we've been stepping through the previous history and ways that people know or potentially know, and answering questions like, or at least attempting to answer questions like, why are you the way you are? But when it comes to things like, again, technology and who controls it, we're starting on this journey of the spectrum of potential ranges, the way that the changes that happen in technology and in society affect each other. And last time we talked about technological determinism and going from the far part of that spectrum, saying that, well, from a hard technological deterministic view, it is that social change and important things that we see within our culture are coming strongly from the actual technology that we use and how it actually affects us overall. But, as we had that discussion last time, it kind of morphed into that some of the historical perspectives on this make it hard to actually consistently stay viewing everything through a technological deterministic from a hard standpoint. That there are social and other ramifications that have come into play. And so that's where you had that kind of discussion around like soft technological determinism, that like as much as the social aspects will play a role, the technology and the artifacts around it are also playing a role with it. So this time we're going to be going into the social construction of technology that is sometimes abbreviated as SCOT. Da, da, da. Social construction of technology, i.e. SCOT. Go and trying for me not to actually do voices. So social construction of technology. So social construction of technology holds that people attach meanings or interpretations to artifacts. So this is around what is technology being physical technology or technology being the ways that we do stuff or communicate, is that we as people attach meanings or interpretations to those artifacts. That could be different depending upon different groups and intentions. So people in social groups direct technological development through their interpretations and meanings, perhaps to its fruition or to defeat. So if this technology keeps being grown or accepted within this time, really is impacted drastically by the social groups of that time that are playing the role of, well, what meaning do they attach to it? What wealth do they go to it? How do people engage with it and change, and how do they use it? So, and this is in the area of pioneering the ideas of the sociology of technology. And like the reading for this week is kind of the stemming point for this, of viewing the more aspects of viewing technology through the people and groups than just the technology and artifacts itself, and what communication goes along there. So example is your school, the schooling that we exist in, exists as a school not just as a building. So again, if we were physically in person, but the idea of that school building actually existing is because others agree that it is a school. So if your school is older than you are, it was created by the agreement by other people before you. In a sense, it exists by consensus, both prior and current. That you're going to school, and say if we were in person or we are in person, whatever time we're going through these videos, of going to Mount Royal and whatever school you're at, is like, well, that's a school you go to, and the reason why it's a school is that we agree that these buildings as a group are being used as an actual school in that actual environment. And sometimes those decisions have been made by social groups before you, i.e. the whole development of Mount Royal as a school from being a college into a university, and directions where you go for those degrees were like designed by prior groups before you, but are still affecting you now, but also sitting in a transitional point of really what is school now and what will it be in the actual future, and what will education be and what's driving it. And like last time, from a technological deterministic view, it's the actual technology playing the bigger role, but from here being like, well, what happens when like the social group interactions with these environments change over time, and what could school be in the future? So before going further, I just want to delve into a video to give an example of someone else talking about the social construction of technology and why the better tech doesn't always win. So just saying that there could have actually been a better designed piece of technology, if this is digital or whatever else, but that it may not always win out because of the social aspects that come into things of what do people accept that they win out. That not every technology we have now means that it's the best. It means what is a group has designed that they want.
Tom Bridge is next. Tom helps small companies manage their technology and most importantly helps digital denizens love their city.
That's right. Evening, everybody. Y'all having fun yet? Yeah. How great were those first two talks? Can we give it up for these guys? So I'm a little bit nervous here, but I'm here tonight to tell you about technology. And I'm here to tell you that better technology doesn't always win. And that's awesome. And that's as important, and you should care about that. But to do about that, I got to talk about STS first. Science and Technology Studies. And so we're going to talk about science and technology studies. And what does that mean? Because it sounds like a great little buzzword you'd put in your sweet presentation. And so we get to talk about sociology of technology, history of technology, and philosophy of technology. First, we're going to talk about the old technological determinism. Evil technological determinism, which says that humanity has no control over the technology that it creates. But, as William Gibson says, the street will find its own uses for things. And so you can use your sweet beat-up washer as an awesome chicken coop. Because that's a great thing to do. And so we can talk a little bit about the problem with technological determinism. There's no accounting for people. There's no accounting for the agency that people bring to the technological discussion and that groups of people can bring to that process. So battles between technological systems exist, and we deal with them every day. One of the most famous is up on that screen. You recognize the logo on the left? Of course you don't. It's Betamax. It didn't make it out. And so it was one of those places where, I was going to say, most of the people in the room didn't get that joke because they're under 25. So it's good for us old people to talk about these things. So we got to talk about the relevant social groups in any given player. You've got to talk about the makers and the inventors, but then you've also got to talk about the users. You've got to talk about the people whose problems you're solving with your technology. And then you've also got to talk about the interpretative flexibility, which is one of those big, huge words that means we got to figure out what the problem is that we're solving, and then we got to solve it. And we got to figure out which solutions out there make for the best solutions, because they're not all equal. And then at the end, we get to choose a winner, and that's what making conclusions are. And so we've kind of stepped through in examining the social groups that are at play. We've got to determine which problems we solve, and then make a decision as a society. And we do that through markets, we do that through participation, and we do that through social media even. And it's fantastic to see it. So how do we use this framework? And this is my one slide that I cheated on because I used it twice. And we get to talk about what do we do with this framework for examining technological systems. We get to identify and assess the social groups. That's the biggest, hugest part of the social construction of technology. You have to figure out who's your market. You got to figure out who's using your technology. And better, what are they using it for? If you're a dryer manufacturer and you've got a huge subset of your population solving their problems and by using their dryers as chicken coops, then you've got to come up with what the use is for your technology and focus on that structure. And so we have to define the problem before we can define the solution. And that kind of steps us back a little bit into an earlier slide where I talked about the logo that no one recognized. Because it's a point where Betamax had a long, full life long after it stopped being Betamax, because their build quality was higher and their image fidelity was tremendous. Any of the original Betamax players out there are probably still working today, not because there aren't any more tapes for them, but really it's just a matter of they were fantastically made. And so the loss of your one market isn't the end of your technology. Betamax goes on to become Betacam SP, which if any of you have ever been to a television studio, you have seen row upon row upon row of phenomenally expensive Betacam SP decks and Digibeta decks and now HD cam decks. That's what's in the broadcast world. They rewrote their solution. They reframed the problem. They figured that the problem was people wanted cheap solutions for their home use, but they wanted a better solution for their technology at the broadcast level. And so those competing narratives that exist there are important. So we need to talk also about systems that win. Twitter is a phenomenally good example here. I can see that everyone's reading as fast as they can. But at that point, every feature that's in Twitter right now is socially constructed. It was built by the community and then canonized. So that's why it beat Jaiku. That's why it beat Pounce and the other competitors in that space, because they listened to their users and they solved their problems for you. Design is not just what it looks like. Design is how it works. And so that's what you have to take away from this when you're analyzing any technology. Design is how it works. Make it work.
So I hope you can get a feel for that, because even that person, that was more from a design conference and get ideas and seeing how the shift of perception of the effect of technology and people going into more the mixing of technology and society and that analysis of where do we go from here. Like, he was talking more from a design and even business perspective, but if you look at companies nowadays, if we're looking at Tesla, if we're looking at Apple and Microsoft, what does it say when they start structuring it around the people and that evaluation of who are using it or who could use it and analyze that? And so really social construction of technology is now just on that other side of the spectrum, but a different way of viewing and analyzing the world around us when we evaluate how people are using technology, but how does that technology even change? What factors come playing a role? And this is purely from the society side. And so the SCOT, so Social Construction of Technology School, has developed as an approach to the general study of technology revolving around the idea of relevant social groups. So what are all the different social groups and different roles? Like, we all are part of different social groups and different roles, but the way that different groups interact with that same piece of technology will change the meaning that it has to those groups and also what wins out over in the future. So social groups are defined in this theory in terms of shared meaning. Members of a group attach the same meaning to a particular technology. So the example given in Pinch and Klein's, this is the reading for this week, is that of high-wheeler bicycles, women interpreting it as an unsafe machine, men as a macho machine. That's one example. And so the varying interpretations of the machine allowed the development of what otherwise would have been considered too dangerous a technology. And so from one side to the other, and what it shifts and changes is that it's not always this, like the technology has a first driving force for a potential for change to happen, but the actual different groups and what they associated it. So even when this comes into, say, even talking about education nowadays, what does it mean for the different groups, from teachers to family to staff to society to the students themselves, and the meaning they placed upon it versus where it could be? And not even saying which side's right or wrong, but you have these different groups that are coming into this, which may change how we interact with that technology. So relevant social groups are generally heterogeneous, so including both technical professionals and consumers, and new groups can emerge over time. So these are changing. It's just not saying that like technology, computers, and everything is just computer geeks. There's everyone else who is related or impacted by it. There's people who are designing the hardware. There's people who are using these devices. These are people that become so ingrained within society for certain aspects of even said jobs or that actual work. And so these will shift and change over time, but each of these groups assigns their own specific meaning to it, and an analysis needs to be done of the entire group of themselves, those meanings, and what happens, and what phases do we go through with our technology, of like how groups in the past versus groups now versus what groups could be in the future. And when these groups are interacting, that these changes can come through those interactions and those different meanings that are then associated with it. So Scott views the development of technology as an iterative process or discourse among technologists or engineers and the relevant or interested social groups. So Scott may be defined as an interactive socio-technical process that shapes all form of technology. So between those designers, the groups that they're part of, the potential groups that are using it, and also what could change it for the groups that they didn't expect and what interpretations they apply to it. So even small stuff that we're used to today, like hashtags and social media, that came out of an unexpected use that social groups were applying a meaning of organization of knowledge that then has spread to other forms from here. But it was through those social interactions that these are actually applied. And so us being affected in our groups and communities we are that go into that design, and then also other people then start using it. And it's all these interactions and that complex web that creates from the social groups we are that goes into the technology that we are using and what gets accepted. So why Scott? Like, why the social construct technology? Why are we thinking about this all? And technologies or innovations like the wheel, the printing press, the bicycle, the assembly line, computers, all shape and organize the world around our lives. And that's what we're saying, like why I'm arguing in this course the importance of technology and even shifting and changing what you view as the common sense view of technology to where we are now, but they are having an impact. And so just like the theories that are coming out of technological determinism is still from the importance of it, but now from a Scott perspective, it's, well, the importance, but then the importance of the social people aspects also that are being affected by the technology, but how they affect that technology back. And what gets adapted to where we are today and understanding the world we are with the technological tools that we are using. So individuals like you and me decide what technologies or parts of technologies are useful, profitable, or comfortable and meaningful to us. And this is the Scott part. And this is why two people in the same room could be looking at the same technological thing and not realize that, like, I have different meanings and things that are associated with it. What I see as use, what is profitable if that matters to someone, and what does profitable actually mean, or comfortable or meaningful. And so groups, assemblies of individuals form, each characterized by particular variables, and each group holding a stake in a technology, where you may have a common view, but who is part of that? And all these groups together having these dialogues over time can then change technology, could be evolving it from a multilinear kind of path to take it to where we are now, and how things could shift in the future, and these shifting groups that we actually even have. So these relevant groups or stakeholders include scientists, technologists, economists, politicians, entrepreneurs, you and me, everybody, like a wider web of everything. That politicians having an effect, economics having an effect on the actual technology of what wins out, what gets accepted, and what's pushing stuff actually forwards and changing stuff within our society. Our desires potentially could make to new things, people trying to just create a new product and find a market for it. Also just the development of creating a social group and culture around a technology, then to also grow and build the technology as a company further in the future. Like, it's a wider range of these different roles. And sometimes we're playing multiple roles within this, of being the scientists and the designers and being the entrepreneurs or being the users of technology. And so even us as individuals are within multiple different groups. Now, between all of this, then, with Scott, you get the idea, an important term being interpretive flexibility right here, is that being these stakeholders and these different groups that we have that are in relation around to some kind of piece of technology, is that each stakeholder characterizes innovations with variant problems and solutions. They interpret the innovation differently. And this is the term interpretive flexibility, of how we are interpreting that technology and the problems around it is flexible between different groups. One innovation may be a solution, but also have a bug. If the bug or problem isn't resolved, the innovation will fail, and relevant social groups or stakeholders will not buy in to this and how we're actually interpreting, even like what we expect to be used versus what it is being expected to use, and those different groups that then have an actual role. And we're going to be talking later on and taking what is in the actual course reading for this week is this example of bicycles that they use, of this evolution of bicycles, which, looking at the image that we see to the right, comes across as a linear evolution from here. But how do we get from each of these versions, and really seeing that it's really a multi-linear kind of approach, and there were different groups that assigned different things to even a common artifact like a bike, and then where it ended up today. And so from examples like being this of like the social construction technology and looking at bikes is thinking things like young men, concerned community members, and high-wheeled vehicles we had back in the day, and how did that change people? Like, what did they want? Why did we have these high-wheeled kind of dangerous bicycles versus other formats, and why did certain things win out versus others, and why were certain technologies changed or people saw new innovations? Where did that come from? And so with all of this and thinking about Scott, you want to look at this diagram and realize if we look at it in the center part of it being an artifact, and this being the technology that we're looking about it, we have associated with that is the social groups. So the producers, the advocates, the users, the bystanders, people all around that artifact. We have a technological frame, so the nature of technology and technological strategy, and we have interpretive flexibility associated with that artifact between the different actual social groups that then all pull it in different directions and may result in new changes for the future that we as a society are more part of that are playing a role. So why Scott again is, however, the interpretive flexibility of technology is not permanent, is that over time, particular interpretations of the technology can come to dominate. And so there's these different groups, but then certain views will start to dominate over and start becoming in our conscious of what's considered to be, in my opinion, common sense or wisdom through our experiences. And why when we generally talk about technology today is that depending on the group you're in, you view it as computers and electronic kind of communications, but we've seen that even the definition of a computer changed over time and what was a common consensus of people interacting with it. Even in earlier days when people didn't see any use potentially for computers at all and didn't see the revolutionary nature that they would have on our society, but that was also from viewing like what groups were part of that and what happened when a computer left from just an academic and military and business application but became something that was more into the public, and there were more different social groups that had their own interpretive flexibility and different needs that then changed the impact of that technology. And so this is why things will change over time. And so in resolving the problems accepted more or less by the significant groups, the social has shaped the technology, hence socio-technical. That it's more the technology, the social side of it shaping the technology, and then, as I would still argue, is that technology will then also come back and then shape us. But from the Scott perspective, it's the social part of it that is the most important. Now, the origins of this actual theory of being Scott specifically were introduced in 1984 by Biker and Pinch. And now I know when you're going to these academic papers and the one for this week that it's longer, that it can be a harsher read, but understand that is one group that is making a new interpretation of even just viewing what technology is and the social aspects of it. And you have to think about, again, look at the time era of 1984 and the development of what we are having from computers and the shift to the actual public domain and other changes that are going on around that time, even for this being pre kind of internet age, being in the actual public. And what does that mean as origin? So this is even they're challenging the idea of technology and what the changes are and arguing for more of the social side of it that comes out of this. That could have been impacted by the different social groups and those need for social movements that were coming out of the 80s and earlier times. So their paper, The Social Construction of Facts and Artifacts, or How Sociology of Science and Sociology of Technology Might Benefit Each Other, introduced the theory and set forth an argument to support it. And so the paper itself identified mechanisms by which the social and the technical kind of interact between these actual artifacts and giving a way to talk about it. And so through the idea of another term I can introduce you to being social constructivism, is that the sociology of science and the sociology of technology had been approached separately before this. That technology, like the sociology of science and what they are separately, and technology were separate. And the sociology of science has recently applied the theory of social constructivism to explain its trajectory of where we're going. And social constructivism holds that knowledge is socially constructed. So not an ultimate truth that's out there that we're knowing, but it's through the social interactions. As such, knowledge and science can be interpreted in different ways. And so even this theory of social constructivism was being new, where we are that going from before of one ultimate truth that's defining things and we are trying to understand it, to our understanding more comes out of the social interactions and the communications that go on around it. So even science itself and our knowledge around it. And so what we understand at all of the world around us and through interpretations comes from that social interaction and communication of that actual information, and then the dominant theories that start pervading out of that social interactions. Who are the dominant groups and who are all playing roles within this? So Byker and Pinch relate this perspective to the progress of technologies. Technologies work or fail because of a range of heterogeneous interpretations and variables, constrained or driving factors that are all part of this, that are all in play through the social aspects and the social groups that have some kind of relevant stake within this technology and how they're interpreting it. So social constructivism and technology hold that people attach meanings or interpretations to those actual artifacts. And so people in social groups direct technological development through their interpretations and meanings, perhaps to fruition or defeat. And this has been said already, but that's the social constructivism kind of side of this, and why this developing idea of Scotty. We've been looking at technology of why do we have the artifacts we have today? Why do we have the devices that we have today? And what wins out? And it's all these different shifting social groups and interpretations that move it forwards, and why we can see technologies that were developed earlier that weren't accepted then, but later on with a different group were accepted at a different time, and realizing that this shifting, changing interpretive flexibility over time is playing a bigger role in technology itself. So some problems is that the studies in sociotechnology are problematic because most studies have been conducted on successful innovations, and few were done on failures before this. Like, why did only certain things win out? And seeing this progress view and the technology doing it, but what happened when things weren't like winning? And the things that failed sometimes failed just because of the groups that were attached to it and that actual meaning. These studies of innovation suggest that there is an implicit assumption that an innovation succeeded as if a magical wand made it so. And the sociological variables that played in a success are not sufficiently analyzed. And this is some of where the views of analyzing sociology and what won out and looking at it from a technological deterministic view kind of made that this is won out. Is the technology itself that won, versus that there were a lot more complex things that were going on at that time with different social groups, of the economy to politically to whatever other groups were attached around that played a bigger role in this. And this is where you get the Byker and kind of the idea of like the central construction of technology, or Scott, is saying, well, these groups start becoming here, and this analysis and looking at sometimes what failed and looking what won, but looking at the groups that are behind it played a role between both. And so again, central constructs of Scott involve the relevant social groups, looking at technology and thinking of like, who are the most influential social groups that could be interested in that innovation that are using it? Like, what researchers? Is it housewives, children, business, filmmakers, governments, utility companies? Who else? Like, what groups are playing a role with this? And that can be applied to our earlier studies of computers, of looking at this was starting from being researchers and theories, but then being academics and military, but then being to larger actual companies that developed out of this, and governments, to then the public itself. And we had these shifting, changing groups of people that then even shifted and changed where the technology could be in the future, because we couldn't see that those groups playing a role, or just didn't analyze it through the lenses of those individuals. So first and foremost, when we're thinking about Scott and we're doing some kind of interpretation look at scenario, we want to look at all the relevant social groups that were playing a role. Next, as I mentioned, is that interpretive flexibility. How do the relevant social groups ascribe meaning to an innovation? What does an innovation mean to a businessman, a housewife, a researcher? What does that mean? So if you know the groups that are associated with it, how are they then all interpreting this? Next to his idea of controversies, like, has another innovation similar to one just diffused? among the relevant social groups, who has the most power or influence from right here, because there's other power dynamics that then come into stuff, and then who's guiding the people or who doesn't, what opens to this, is there other controversies at that time for changing it, is there battling innovations that were coming in now that existed predominantly and then are battling against what could be from the future, like from the mechanical to electrical mechanical to the purely electrical, what wins out for the actual choices, and who are the dominant groups that then push things forwards at this time, or the different groups and roles that they all played in a different way. So variables such as economic factors, political factors, business advantages come to the fore throughout all of this. Vehement debates take place among the relevant social groups and the groups that have the most to gain or lose from these actual use. And so what does it mean around that artifact? That some may not see that there's any use to that artifact itself. Others see that there's more dominance, what they can get out of it, and what happens between all these interactions. Now, also another central construct of Scott is the proposal of strategies for resolving a controversy may involve redesigning to meet the specs of the new stakeholders, strong marketing campaigns, some more truthful than others, like these different things that are like, how can I guide? And even the idea of marketing coming out being such an important thing that we, again, just take for common sense today, but wasn't so dominant previously. Now, when looking at the Biker paper and do all of this, that sometimes they'll do diagrams and use different symbols to kind of visually show the interactions around an artifact of a social group and then their problems that they have in relation to it, then a problem and then potential solutions, and then the connections between those actual groups. Like visually seeing here drawn out where they were doing an analysis of different things that were coming from bicycle groups that were playing a role from right here. So between an artifact. So being the actual groups themselves, an artifact, who are the other things we're designing around this, and where do we come from? Now, another central construct of Scott is then the idea of stabilization, that one group overcomes another. And the innovation of this group has been socially constructed through socially relevant groups, controversies, and the technical framework. And so that at some point in time there may be controversies and shift in between what happens, but then there's some kind of stabilization of what happens, which then could result in more changes and controversies in the future, but we're stabilizing between multiple different things to bring to what we have now. So even the idea of like, what is a computer now today? What is technology today? And all these different groups that then play a role as part of it. So eventually Scott, so the social constructive technology suggests the problem stabilizes, or we hit also what's called closure. So interpretive and design flexibility collapse, and there becomes more of a common meaning, that there's not such dominant groups that are fighting between each other, but there becomes more of a consensus or common sense, you could say. We could have things like rhetorical closure, when social groups see the problem is solved, often a result of advertising setting a norm, strong marketing campaigns, some trying to be truthful than others, but like that we are hitting some kind of things that more of the groups, there may be other groups that are doing this, but there's more of a dominant groups, and between different groups it comes stabilized. Or redefinition of the problem. So a design can solve a new problem so well that previous issues are forgotten, redesigning to meet the specs of the stakeholders and trying to work with it, where things could have lost out or could have won throughout all of this, and the social groups playing a part of it. But even from all of this, going from that first, the idea of the social groups and their interpretive flexibility, and then the controversies and dialogues around it, and some kind of stabilization and closure over time, is this doesn't mean that closure is then permanent in this view. Is that new designs are always being tried, so cardboard bike, recumbent bikes, other things like that, and new social groups continuously form around these as they change. So even what we have technology today, what is a computer, and then who is actually using them, and our technologies start having an actual impact from those groups themselves. And so it's always this kind of shifting thing that will, I believe, never really stop. And so what we see as common sense today was shaped through the social construction and our interactions and communications and dialogues around these artifacts, but taking what we see as common sense today may not be what's common sense in the actual future, because it's this ever-evolving process and new groups form all the time. New designs are coming out of everything, even if it's just a slight shift and marketing of an older design, but taken in a different way and marketed a different way and attached to a different group, and that group assigning different meanings to it, then it extends to the future. Because what I've seen personally as technology from being younger to nowadays to what it could be and what you do is all the different groups that are then involved. like anyone's interactions with new cryptocurrencies or NFTs, and where could that actually be in the future. So really, when you're looking at stuff and saying, again, if we're trying to analyze stuff from a technological deterministic point, we look at the technology, then looking how it changed society. But coming from analyzing stuff with a Scott perspective is first look at the particular artifact. Be cautious of controversies and moral panic. Look for how other similar innovations reach closure. Identify the relevant social groups. Who has the power and why? How has the technology influenced the power? Look at economics, politics, business advantages coming to the fore. Vehement debates take place among the relevant social groups. That groups have the most to gain or lose out of all this. How do these groups interpret the tech? What their technology framework, like worldview, how do they define and evaluate tech themselves? And has society's understanding of the tech stabilized or not? And if so, which closure wins out? And is it still closed, or is it changing or shifting over time as we have this? And so you can look at different things and analyze them from a technological deterministic viewpoint and the Scott viewpoint, and then see, well, where does it on the spectrum, which things are actually interpreting themselves, or is it somewhere in between where we're at that soft technological deterministic and some impact of Scott between here, and the two are having a conversation back and forth for changes for stuff for the future. So, famous example, and this is more coming from the Biker and Pinch reading as you go through it, is that they use the example of the plastic called Bakelite to illustrate their idea of social forces at work in shaping technology. And Bakelite is an early plastic that you'll see examples like this to the actual right of, like some used in jewelry or other things, but this new forming world of resins and other materials to create things. And what does that mean for design? And a quote from them is like, many histories of synthetic plastics start by describing the technically sweet characteristics of Bakelite. These features are then used implicitly to position Bakelite as the start point of the glorious development of the field. God said, let Bakelite be, and all was plastics. But that's a viewpoint, that this is that technologically deterministic viewpoint, that this new technology, this new hero kind of invention, then spirited the linear evolution of the new world of plastics that are coming out of it. But they argue that there's more things that came out of this. That at first, Bakelite was not really recognized as a marvelous synthetic resin. And this situation didn't change for 10 years. It wasn't just introduced and it changed everything. They didn't see anything. But then we had a huge social impact that we realized also had an impact on computers is World War I and World War II. And World War I, the markets for plastics got worse. And dumping of war supplies of phenol used to make Bakelite helped to drop the price and compete against other semi-natural resins that were out there. That it wasn't just Bakelite and other things, that there was all this different world of resins and what was being done. But then an economic factor in one group came into this, is that the production and the price of it suddenly became cheaper, so it became more desirable to use this kind of resin over one other, and it wasn't just a linear choice that played this. And so accidental dumping of materials that make up Bakelite proved that the material could be molded into plastics. The innovation was redirected for the use of plastics and all of its applications. So it was used in military applications first, but then the dumping and the cheap nature of it, and people realizing other uses potentially from it for this new material, that it showed a whole new direction of the way it could actually be used and production could be done. And the scientists who developed Bakelite did not envision the use as a plastic and the many ways that plastic is actually used. So the people who developed this in the beginning and were looking for materials for different reasons, and that's one group of stakeholders who had a role in it. But then the economics of it being cheaper and other people seeing a new material and trying to use something that then becomes, it's a cheaper kind of material, and then using it a different way than was expected by the actual original people who are from this. And you're starting to see these different social groups that are playing a role and new social groups kind of developing out of it. Now, another example that they use throughout the actual paper is the history of the bicycle itself. Like, what we see as the bicycle today being common sense is not the same as back in the day, and even to different groups, what a bicycle actually is will change. And so even the shape of it and what we see between the size of tires and those designs over time and what we're seeing now, and this vision of even what's on this slide of being what's considered the general safety or general purpose kind of bike versus what could it be in the actual future, and different social groups that are playing a role of it. And so, for example, for a start, I just want to play this video, which is just kind of a timeline of what you could say is the evolution of the bicycle. But please don't take this as a linear evolution. This it presents it linearly, but realize it was more of a multilinear and all these different designs and social groups around the artifact and technology of a bicycle that played a role into the development of different ones that were there. So one thing there is that you were just presented with a visual nature of change in the bikes, but we have to make a question of, well, what changed those designs? And again, the biker paper goes into more of analyzing this and realizing when they looked around these evolution of the actual technology and looking at it from a social perspective of first analyzing and looking for the groups and seeing what those groups played a role, then that was changing. Like they realized what an impact the actual groups and this discourse over time that they were viewing of the interpretive flexibility, the closure, stabilization, the generation of new groups and new dialogues started shifting what we are seeing and where we got to it. So history of the bicycle and invention of the safety bicycle that we're seeing here, and you're seeing on the right is a much older version of a bicycle, and one I would not want to ride my friggin' self. It looks painful to go over any bumps or anything you were dealing with. And the bicycle has changed a lot from its beginnings in Germany as a pedal-free dandy horse, which is basically just a plank of wood with two wheels. You move by running along like a Flintstones car. And realize also at this time is who was using this. This was more, I believe, aristocracy or the upper class as a new device. And like a new even idea of vehicles and these idea of wheels at this time and just even play. And it was the one beginning point of just this movement and using it. And where it was of these rigid forms that we're seeing there to what we have now. And that it was just evolving on its own, but these dialogues between different groups and times and economics that were playing a role that shifted throughout time. So the animated video showed the two-wheel vehicle design from the dandy horse at its as it gains pedals and gears, as the wheels change size, with a brief stop at the penny farthing, the ultimate observed model. You'll see it's on the front huge wheel that we'll talk later on, and then finally to our modern road bike, that our general consensus of what you see. That's still shifting and changing today, but what you would see today is the common sense view of a bike versus other devices that you wouldn't have seen before. That's even seeing like this to look to getting beyond just that linear view. This is somewhat of a map of different designs up from older ones of the dandy horse that you can see at the top, the penny farthing, to then other designs of actual bikes. And you can see all these variations that we're having, that there isn't just one linear path, that you have this complex web of different things and artifacts and designing, but that seems to be coming to some kind of design or closure from earlier versions that seems common, but these different groups that are having an effect to it, to where we see things nowadays, but where they could be, and still changing. So we don't have a single evolution of the bike. But what caused all of these changes? And again, coming from a Scott perspective, that was predominantly the social groups that are around it, that are applying their interpretive flexibility and then having dialogues around it, and new markets coming into place for the design and new changes, and new designs being accepted due to the desires of those potential groups, or that dialogue of what's happening back and forth that keeps changing over time. So one view, social constructive technology, different groups of people or stakeholders had an impact due to their desires. In Scott, the development process of a technological artifact is described as an alternation of variation and selection. That there are some changes and different groups then find that this fits a need that they didn't see before, or new groups find a whole new thing they never had from it, and it hits something along those lines. And so evolution is multi-directional rather than linear. So other examples from here, even going back to 1885, a ladies' magazine advice column and interpretation of one group at that time. Things like, the mere fact of riding a bicycle is not in itself sinful, and it is in the only means of and if it is the only means of reaching a church on Sunday, it may be excusable. And you're seeing this dialogue from here of like even devices and a sinful nature being applied to them, but if they're being used for a good means, maybe this could be better. And this is going from what ladies were supposed to do and give advice at the time, that ladies shouldn't be actually riding bicycles, and that was associated for one group, versus this is more masculine domination. And at that time, there's still these groups being used between it, but then a dominant form being a masculine view, or what could be viewed, whatever is masculine, of one group having a design or control over it. Another example quote is from the Daily Telegraph in 1887. Bicycling is a healthy and manly pursuit with much to recommend it, and unlike other foolish crazes, it has not died out. And so even the desires of this healthy nation and gendering it to use being different groups, and what does that mean to different groups? So earlier examples of bikes, going back to what could be categorized as the bone shakers. So that's what the dandy horse and others you see here. And what you're seeing to the right is actually a whole different ranges of bikes. But why did certain one win out over other? Like, why do we have these two-wheeled ones with seats? Why do we not still always have a whole lot more dominance of the petty horse? What issues do bikes like this create when, say, certain groups had to wear certain articles of clothing? Like if it was someone who had to wear a longer skirt, how do you have a certain bike that is designed that does not work for them versus others? So either way, going back, is like with the bone shaker, right here is a name used from about 1869 up to the present time to refer to the first type of true bicycles with pedals, which was called velocipede. I'm saying that wrong, but I'm still going to go with velocipede because it makes it sound proper, but I know I'm saying that wrong. But either way, by its manufacturer's bone shaker, referring to the extremely uncomfortable ride which was caused by the stiff wrought iron frame and wooden wheels surrounded by tires made of iron, which is, again, materials and what was known at that time versus galvanization and plastics, and how that also had an effect on changing stuff, which is still having a little bit of technological deterministic stuff, having a shift in what we have in society of the materials causing a shift itself, but then the social groups after that attaching new meanings and changing the evolution. So coming after that and being one example of a really crazy bike is, why did you have some of these before the bone shakers for the design, but then suddenly creating this hugely extreme penny farthing design of a massive front wheel? Like, why was that then a design that came out? And the penny farthing, also known as a high wheel or high wheeler and ordinary, is a type of bicycle with a large front wheel and a much smaller rear wheel. It was popular after the bone shaker until the development of the safety bicycle in the 1880s. And it was the first machine to be called a bicycle at that time. But why did this win out? But again, think back to those quotes we're seeing earlier and these time in the 1880s and the view of which dominant groups were putting certain interpretive flexibilities around it for the manly pursuit of what's needed around these versus other groups that then wanted something else as a device. These penny farthings, they were fast but unsafe. The rider was high up in the air and traveling at great speed. If he hit a bad spot in the road, he could easily be thrown over the front wheel and be seriously injured. Two broken wrists were common in attempts to break a fall, or even people being killed. Taking a header, also known as coming a cropper, was not at all uncommon. The rider's legs were often caught underneath the handlebars, so falling free of the machine was often not possible from this. And so the dangerous nature of these bicycles made cycling the preserve of the adventurous young men or adventurous people, the risk adverse, such as the elderly gentlemen preferred the more stable tricycles or quadricycles. In addition, women's fashion of the day made the ordinary bicycle inaccessible. That these high-wheeling, that dominant groups that female identifying had to wearing like longer dresses that did not fit to this actual bicycle, and their adaptation and desires around it are different from others there at this time. And so the safety bicycle also developed. The safety bicycle was arguably the most important change in the history of the bicycle. It shifted their use and public perception from a dangerous toy for sporting young men to an everyday transport for men and, crucially, women of all ages. And so this different desire of one design versus others that came out in different groups that then had their interpretation around a bike and what filled needs, and then a wider range of groups that were then opened up, of more groups of being women, men, elderly, and other people, that the safety bike design that we're seeing here to the actual right, something more common today, became a little bit more desirable, and then different uses for even just freedom of motion to get around. And so we see them again between the penny farthing to the actual idea of the safety bike, is that they're both the idea of bicycles, the two-wheeled pedals that are moving stuff forwards, but different ones allowed for different things and different meaning for social groups, and being closure for some created openings for others, and this shift and change. And it was these social groups that had impacted the evolution of the new devices. And with the new designs of safety bikes and more groups playing a role of it, there were more designs that then evolved from that, versus we don't see as many penny farthing bikes today, which they still do exist out there as part of it, but it's not what's driving force, because there's a different change in the dominant groups and what's needed with them over time, around time. So 20-year process, not a single event, not a linear development, and influenced by society, economy, and social groups. And that with the current bikes we have today, we're kind of in a stabilized kind of view of it, and different social groups had an effect on the overall development of the bicycle. But that doesn't mean it's not going to change. Like we have recumbent bikes and the new revolution of e-bikes and electrical bikes that we've seen today, developing off of actual safety bikes, and new groups and different economics and views of transportation between different societies come and playing a role of where could it still keep developing and reopening in the actual future. And so one thing, take an example, going from the bicycle and taking a humorous and swear-filled video from right here, what groups and common meanings are present in this video? That we still have the bicycle throughout all of this, but now look at these different groups that you may be aware of and the different associations around a bike. And also, let's just have a little bit of humor in this course for a while.
I rise in the morning and greet the day. Pull out the bike and I'm on my way. The transportation shows I care. Every turn of the pedal cleans the air. Green and the green, I'm saving the planet. Just like my friends Dale, Sean, Toby, and Janet. No greenhouse gas, a tiny carbon footprint up your ass. I'm on a motherfucking bike. I'm on a motherfucking bike. Share my aggression, what I do. Every day ride the tour to fuck you. Banging on hoods, I kick it in fenders. Running away a holic on a permanent bender. Running red lights at the front intersection. Cut out seat, protect my erection. Let the bird in my hand take two from a motherfucking track stand. On my bike. I'm on a motherfucking bike. I'm on a motherfucking I'm on a motherfucking bike. I'm on a motherfucking bike. On a motherfucking bike. Skinny ass pants, the stash is fat. The canvas kicks, the ear flap hats. Got no gear me, so you best not diss me. Yeah, bitch, it's a motherfucking fixie. Middle of the street is where you're gonna find me. A shitload of traffic backed up behind me. The critical mass is a Facebook like. I'm on a motherfucking bike. 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 I'm on a motherfucking bike.
So, humorous, but we still do see different groups that are playing here. Another example that's not in the paper, what we could talk about that's still relevant today and even shifting here is like, what about the actual smartphones? And viewing it from a social constructivist kind of viewpoint of analyzing what groups we have there. So what about social groups that are relevant to smartphones? And you can probably think larger within this, but that's that first starting point that we need to, again, view stuff from a Scott perspective of what kind of different relevant social groups could there potentially be around that artifact. Like what about, I'm just presenting these 6 here and you could probably think of more, but what about business people versus K to 12 kind of elementary school students? What about college and university students? Police, government, and family. And first starting from those actual groups, but think about the different potential interpretive flexibility standpoints we could have between all of them and the interactions of which one's dominating versus others. Like business people. Useful thing for scheduling and communication, work hours, though get expanded into personal time because with a smart device you're always on. People expect you to always be on. K to 12 students, so entertainment and communication varies with age. It could be addictive and distracting and maybe privacy issues. College university students, so communication, social and academic support, access to your teachers and fellows and unaccessed information. Right here, distraction and diminishing social communication of what's expected potentially. Police. So criminals communicate, harder to track crimes. Accountability, so video and image of police actions and different things around for review of roles to even access to information remotely for police. Government, so communication to and from the public. Security of government information can become an issue. Governmental employees, public posting, etc. Family. So communication between family members, texting, addictive technologies in the home of good or bad. Like you have all these different groups that then if you view it from there that we could all be part of in different ways, but they're all having these conversations around the actual smartphone and then what starts shaping that and businesses. So these are all stuff that you could take from the view and analyzing coming from a different way, but they're all playing a role in changing what we see as a smartphone today versus where could it actually be in the actual future itself. Now, Scott, unlike a technological deterministic view, is that we recognize there is often debate about the value and need of technology. Rejection and change can happen, and during the development/invention phase and for a time after it is initially enters the consumer market. So again, what computers were versus what they are now, and we view that from a social constructive viewpoint, you can see the impacts it had from those different groups and how they can stabilize and change what we have now, but then could keep changing then into the actual future. Scott allows for spectacular breakdown, i.e. also like Chernobyl disaster is the fact of like the development of nuclear power and then how an event like the Chernobyl nuclear disaster can also shift publicly the perception of that technology and the demand for it in the future. And overall, even if it can still be a good technology, the social consensus around it could change if it even moves forward at all. And probably why you'll see there's a lot of social marketing around products to sell them as well, because that social drive to keep those products can move it forward as well. So general criticisms of the social construction of technology is that too many of the actors are black boxes that the theory doesn't explain. Like, what about social and ethical consequences of technology and the impacts? How does one decide who the relevant social groups are? What about deeper underlying causes for change, like cultural, intellectual, economics? Too much of a focus on the design stage of an interaction, why it fits in a design world really well, and it ignores political concerns that have an impact, but still has its role. But again, Scott, so the technological determinism and the social construction of technology create a spectrum, for at least right now, to talk, and there can be more. And both are true in certain circumstances and to a certain degree, but most academics would tend towards Scott nowadays as the explanation for our relationship with technology. And probably what some of you have realized, what you've just accepted as your common sense, because of where you stand, but you should still realize I would still argue personally for a soft technological deterministic view, is that the technology still had an effect on you independently and the choices of where we are, but then the actual social group associated around it can also have an impact. And we have seen that technology is developed on evolutionary path and that we co-evolve with it, and Scott fits with this nicely. Doesn't mean it's the end of this discussion. There's a lot more theories that are out there, but it's one thing to take into account yourself when you're working in this field or working with technology and realizing a wider range of groups and this kind of evolution of what happens. And so again, what we see as common sense today is still something that developed out of the social constructivism kind of view of these interactions. And what is common sense today may not be what is common sense in the actual future. And that shift, and not just to fall into the trap of common sense. So the same technology in a different society creates different relationships, like cars, bikes, TVs in North America versus Europe. We've seen that from technological deterministic standpoint, but we can also see then that Scott fits for this better, is that social groups are different between these locations as well. And so even around the artifacts, it changes from one side to the other of this evolution and then moves through our world. But again, still, technological determinism runs strong. Like, watch for examples in the news and how we talk. Like, even this way older article, but even from 2015, of digital amnesia and how technology could be eroding our memory, is that it's still kind of on the spectrum of like that. Just as we talked about in a technological determinism video, is that we've created a technology, but then it becomes separate from us, and those things then come back and change us as well. But we're kind of co-evolving with this over this time of it creates this new technology, things create moments that then can have these new dialogues and new social groups and change. And so even around the idea of computers in the field and the world that we are today created whole new groups and whole new studies of fields. And it still can ever change, and it's one way to view the world around us and understand these different groups that are playing a role. So again, the reading for this week is Pincher and Biker, The Social Construction of Facts and Artifacts. So even this is a harder read. Yes, it's a longer one, but this is where this whole kind of term was given to the idea of the social construction of technology, and had an impact on a wide range of fields that, again, you may not have seen in your life, but people before you that were designing stuff were impacted by this actual view that then is permeated out to other people. So things to think about while reading. Why do they claim that science knowledge is socially constructed? Why isn't it just facts that are universal? With their bicycle example, was it multi-directional linear development, which I've argued it's more of a multi-directional? Who were the social groups that defined bicycles based on their different perspectives, aka interpretive flexibility? And how did the definition of a bicycle reach closure or become stabilized, and why? Towards that safety bicycle of what we see, but where could it still be now, taking that and evolving from there to the future to other designs? Determine what the authors mean by not only that there is flexibility in how people think of or interpret artifacts, but also that there is flexibility in how artifacts are designed. And finally, what does this mean if you are someone working in the technological field today? Like, what does this mean for the actual groups and what you get used to? Like, what does it mean for the technology and currency and NFTs and cryptocurrency and all the other groups that are associated around us in this development of it? Like, is the NFT and cryptocurrencies the new penny farthing of a design, or is it to the new safety bike or something different? And what are the groups around it, and where could this be in change, and who starts getting actually involved, and how do we start viewing the world from this social kind of aspect, and how has that impacted how we are viewing stuff? But either way, from there, that's the end of this kind of rambling from your like old teacher. But I hope, as always, that as we progress through the semester, and as I know as difficult as things can be, I still hope that you first and foremost try to take care of yourself. And then also try to think of the groups and other people that are around you, that maybe not everyone is doing as good as you think. And so if we can take care of ourselves and at least attempt to do actions for others and try to look at some kindness for others, maybe we can keep progressing and change our views of the world around us and just kind of live and be better people. What is a better person? I don't know. I just know I think all of you are awesome people as always. And if you think you're not awesome, I once again always disagree with you, and I think you're awesome. So continue on with your day and continue on being great people.